Thank you to all of you for coming along. Now, as Tom mentioned, I'm a researcher at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where I specialize in mathematical models of infectious disease. So on the face of it, my job couldn't be further, really, from the world of casinos and playing cards and plastic chips. But really, science and gambling have an incredibly intertwined relationship, a really long-standing history, and that's what I want to talk about this evening. And seeing as I'm talking about gambling, I thought I would start with an example of how not to gamble. So this is a story from a few years ago, and as you can probably notice, there's two large flaws with this lady's strategy. The first is it's completely illegal. The second is it clearly doesn't work. And the reason I wanted to show you this is I think when we talk about people taming chance and beating the system, typically these are two themes that crop up quite a lot. You either have them doing something a bit dodgy, or you have them presenting a system which clearly isn't going to do something very successful. And what I want to do this evening is take a look at a third approach, take a look at some of the ways in which mathematicians and scientists have taken on games of chance and used their techniques to get an edge over the house. I also want to look at how the ideas have flowed the other way, how actually games and gambling have inspired many ideas which are now fundamental to modern maths and science. And really, lotteries, I think, are a good place to start, because for me, it was a story about lotteries that first got me interested in the mathematics of betting. As I'm sure any of you who played the lottery or thought about playing lottery will know, it's incredibly difficult to win. But actually, even the way we measure how difficult it is to win is a fairly recent development. Although maths it's been around for millennia, the idea of how we quantify luck, how we quantify a random event, is a relatively recent one. It was one that was developed in the 16th century. And it was actually in Renaissance Italy. There was an Italian called Girolamo Cardano. He was a physician. As a doctor, he was the first to describe the clinical symptoms of typhoid. He was also a gambler. And as a gambler, he was the first to describe such games mathematically. And he actually outlined what's known as the sample space. So this is all of the combinations of events that could occur. And obviously, if you're only interested in one of those, that gives you a sense of how difficult it is to win. Now, for the UK National Lottery as it stands, you have to pick 6 numbers from a possible set of 59. So this results in just over 45 million possible combinations of numbers you could pick if you bought a card. Clearly, this makes life very difficult for you to win the jackpots. But there is a way that you can guarantee you will win the lottery this weekend. And that is quite simply to buy up every single combination of numbers. Now, that might sound a little bit absurd, but let's just run with it for a moment. As I said, there's 45 million combinations of tickets for the UK lottery. So if you were to buy up every single possible combination and line them up end to end, it would actually stretch from London to Dubai. What's more, each ticket costs £2. So if you really want to win the jackpot this weekend, it's going to cost you around £90 million to achieve. Clearly, that's not a feasible strategy, but not all lotteries are the same. In the 1990s, for example, the Irish National Lottery had a much smaller sample space, a much smaller possible combination of numbers that could come up. In fact, there were about 1.94 million combinations. Each ticket costs 50p, so as a result, it would cost you less than £1 million to buy up every single combination. And actually, a syndicate headed up by an accountant got thinking about this. And clearly, most weeks, this is a pretty poor investment, because the jackpot would be maybe a few hundred thousand. And if you're spending almost £1 million to win a few hundred thousand, it doesn't take much to spot that's a pretty bad investment. But if a rollover were to come around, maybe this could be plausible. And actually, rather than stretching to Dubai, if you lined up all of these tickets and the combinations end to end, it would actually stretch from London to Plymouth. So, you've got something that's a bit more doable. And what they started to do is to collect together these tickets and fill each one out by hand to get every single one of these combinations. And then they waited. They waited for about 6 months until the Maybank holiday in 1992, when the rollover hit 2.2 million. And they put their plan into action. They took all these tickets they'd filled out, started taking them to shops, and buying them up. And in many cases, this raised some attention. So shops that would usually sell maybe 1,000 tickets in a week were suddenly selling 15,000. The lottery, perhaps expectedly, frowned upon this a little bit and tried to stop them. And as a result, when the lottery draw came around, they'd only bought 80% of the possible combinations of tickets. So still an element of luck as to whether they'd win the jackpot. Fortunately for them, that jackpot winning set of numbers was within the combinations that they bought up, so they won that week. Unfortunately, there were 2 other winners that week. So they had to split the jackpot. But when you added up all those lower tier prizes that they'd matched up 5 numbers, 4 numbers as well, they walked away with a profit of £300,000. Now, for me, years ago when I heard the story, that was just a fantastic illustration of how you can take a pretty simple mathematical insight, a good dose of audacity and hard work, and convert it into something that's profitable. And this isn't the only instance that people have targeted these kind of games. For the UK lottery, the draw is random, so really the only way you can guarantee a win is to use this brute force approach by simply buying up all of the combinations. But not all lotteries are the same. Take scratch cards, for example. On the face of it, scratch cards are completely random. If you kind of think about it, they can't be completely random, because if you're producing scratch cards, and you just randomly generate which cards are going to be winners, there's a chance that by sheer chance, you will produce too many winning cards. If you're a company making scratch cards, you want some way of controlling and limiting which prizes go out. As statisticians would call it, you need controlled randomness. You want the prizes to be fairly uniformly, evenly distributed amongst locations, but you don't want the generation of them to be completely random. And actually, in 2003, a statistician called Mohan Survansa was thinking about scratch cards. He'd been given some as a joke present and was wondering about this idea of controlled randomness. And he realized there must be some way for the lottery to identify which cards were winners without having to scratch them off. On each card, there were a series of digits, and some of these would appear 2 times, 3 times, but some numbers and symbols only appeared once on the card. And actually, if these unique numbers appeared in a row, that card was always a winner. And he went and bought more cards and tested out his strategy, and every single time, the cards that had these numbers in a row were guaranteed winners. Now, what would you do in this situation? You've essentially cracked scratch cards. You've got a system which can identify the winning ones and the not winning ones just by looking at them. Would you go out and buy tons? What would you do? Well, think back to that slide I showed you at the start. Winning scratch cards are remarkably rare. And actually what Mohan did, rather than just going on a huge scratch card buying spree, was work out how long it would take him to buy up enough cards and guarantee himself a win. And he was a statistician and working on geological problems, earning pretty decent money. And he realized that actually, although he had a winning lottery strategy, it was better off just to stick in his existing job. So what he did was he rang up the lottery and told them that there was a hidden code on their scratch cards and he had deciphered it and he knew how to win. The lottery, of course, didn't take him seriously. So what he did was actually collected the scratch cards and he identified some winning ones, some losing ones, divided them into 2 piles and posted them by courier to the lottery. That evening he got a phone call from the lottery saying, "We need to have a chat." And really, this story is representative of a lot of areas of gambling. Often, it's not professional gamblers who come up with these strategies that beat the system. And often, people who beat the system don't become professional gamblers. For a lot of these people, gambling is almost a playground for ideas. It's a way of testing out problem-solving and skills that actually would apply to many other industries. People who've targeted these problems moved into academia, into finance, into business. And as I mentioned with Cardano, this isn't a new phenomenon. Really, throughout history, many of the great thinkers and mathematicians have used gambling as a way of refining their ideas. In around 1900, a French mathematician called Henri Poincaré was particularly interested in gambling. Now, Poincaré was one of what's known as the last universalists. As a mathematician, he was one of the last people to specialize in almost every area of the subject as it existed at the time. It hadn't expanded to the point where it was as large as it is today. And one of the things he was interested in was predictability. And to him, unexpected events, unexpected outcomes were the result of ignorance. He thought, if something's unexpected, it's because we're ignorant of the causes. And he classed these problems by what he called the 3 levels of ignorance. The top level was a situation where we know what the rules are, we have the information, we just have to do some basic calculations. So if you've got, say, a school physics exam, you know what the physical laws are, you're given the information, so in theory you should be able to get the right answer. If the answer is surprising, then you've done something wrong in the working. But it's not a kind of difficult level of ignorance to escape in theory. The second level of ignorance, according to Poincaré, was one where you know what the rules are, but you lack the information necessary to carry out the calculations accurately. And he used roulette as an example. So a roulette table, you start a ball spinning round and round, and he observed that a very small change in the initial speed of the ball could have a very dramatic effect on where it ends up, because it's going to be circling this table over time. And nowadays, mathematicians refer to this as sensitive dependence on initial conditions, and popularly it's known as the butterfly effect. There's a talk in the 70s where a physicist pointed out that a butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil could cause or perhaps prevent a tornado in Texas. These very small changes, which Poincaré first observed, could have a very large effect later on, and then we'll say that the result is random, it's down to chance, but really it's a problem of information. Then comes the third degree of ignorance, and this is where we don't know the rules, or perhaps they're so complex we'll never be able to untangle them. And in this situation, all we can do is watch over time and try and gain some understanding of what we're observing. And it's really this level of ignorance when gamblers started targeting roulette that they focused on. They didn't try and untangle all of these physical laws, they just said, well, let's just watch a load of roulette spins at a table and see if there's a bias, see if there's something odd going on with this table. But this raises the question of what do we actually mean by odd? What do we mean by biased? And while Poincaré was thinking about roulette in France, on the other side of the channel, a mathematician called Karl Pearson was also thinking about roulette. And Pearson was fascinated by random events. As he said, we can't have any true sense of what nature does. We can only observe and try and make inferences on those observations. And he was really keen to collect random data to test out these kind of ideas. On one occasion, he spent his summer holiday flipping a coin 25,000 times to generate a data set to analyze. And he was also interested in roulette. Now, fortunately for him, at the time, the Le Monaco newspaper would publish the results of all the roulette spins in the casinos in Monte Carlo. Now, for Pearson, this is a fantastic data set. He wants to test out his ideas about randomness. You've got all these previous roulette spins to test it out on. And he started looking at ways to understand whether they were random or not. And a roulette table, of course, you've got these black and red numbers, and then you've got a 0. And if you take out the 0, over time, you'd expect the proportion of black and red to be even. You'd expect it to kind of be 50-50 over time. And when Pearson looked at the data, he found that red came up 50.15% of the time. This was over about 16,000 spins. So according to his calculations, this wasn't that implausible. So actually, that kind of deviation from the expected value is reasonable given the kind of data set he had. But then he continued, and he looked, for instance, at how often pairs of numbers appear. Now, if you've got a random process, a roulette table, sometimes you'd expect there to be a string of the same color appearing purely by chance. You might get a few reds coming up, a few blacks. But what Pearson found was that the numbers switched too often. That actually, you didn't get these strings of the same color appearing as often as you might expect. They were kind of switching over. And to him, this was pretty definitive evidence that the tables were corrupt, that they were biased. And as he puts it, if I had been observing these tables since the start of geological time on Earth, I would not have expected to see a result that extreme. And he actually suggested that they close down the casinos and donate the proceeds to science. As it happened, there was something a little bit more down to earth going on. It turned out that those journalists from Le Monaco, rather than sitting by the tables and recording the numbers, instead have been sitting in the bar and making them up. But this idea, think back to how he phrased it, that it was the probability of observing an event as extreme as the one I've observed. This was the first kind of forays into what's known as hypothesis testing. Nowadays, whether we work in clinical trials or on particle physics experiments, we use the principles that Pearson honed on these roulette tables and coin tosses to understand whether we have enough evidence to reject or accept a certain hypothesis. So in this case, his hypothesis was that the tables were random, and he had enough evidence to say that this wasn't the case. And actually, gamblers have also used these ideas throughout Victorian times and moving into, so late 1940s, for example, two medical students used these kind of methods to go, and unlike the lazy journalists, they actually watched the tables this time, collected all the data, and found that there were biases. These tables wore down over time, and certain numbers or areas would appear more often than not. And actually, they went around Nevada and gambled a lot of these tables, and the exact figure was never known, but they did buy a yacht and sail around the Caribbean for a year. So a pretty successful strategy. The problem for gamblers, though, is casinos kind of cottoned on to what they were doing, and they would make sure that tables were incredibly well maintained, and you didn't have these biases occurring. But in the 60s and 70s, some physics students realized that this actually leaves you in the second level of ignorance, because if you've got a very pristine, well-maintained roulette table, it's not a statistics problem, it's a physics one. As one of them said, it's kind of like having a planet orbiting a point. You've got this ball going around. And in the 70s, a group of students at University of California, Santa Cruz, actually kind of started doing these calculations, and they looked at roulette spin. They said, well, to start off with, the croupier will spin the ball, and it would go around the edge of the track, around the rim of the table. And often it will go around a couple of times before the croupier calls no more bets. In other words, you have a window in which you can collect information on what the ball's doing and act on it. You can place bets during this period. Over time, it would drop down onto the track and sort of spin freely. They eventually hit one of these deflectors and land in one of the pockets. And what they actually did, testing out their strategy on different tables in their lab, was realize that if you could calibrate your model, so if you could write down the equations for the physical system, you've got the ball going around, it's slowing down, and then it drops down. You could write down these equations and calibrate them to a specific table, then in that initial bit of time, you could collect enough information to improve your predictions about where the ball would land. You'd never get it exactly, but you didn't need to. You just need to get some idea of which region of the table it's going to land in, enough to get an edge over the casino. It's all well and good, of course, doing that in a classroom and working through all the equations, but in a casino, you need to do it in real time. You need to do that on the casino floor as the ball is spinning. So what these teams actually did was come up with hidden computers to do these calculations in person. Now, wearable technology is, of course, all around us these days, but the first wearable computer was designed for this purpose, as it happens. And because it was a new technology, there were, of course, some drawbacks with this. They'd often give themselves electric shocks, for example. And as well as this, as I mentioned, things are very sensitive to initial conditions. So if the weather changed, they'd need to recalibrate to the roulette table. On one occasion, they were actually losing a fair bit of money and couldn't quite work out why until they realized there was an overweight tourist further down, leaning on the table and screwing up all of their predictions. So really, these kind of methods were somewhat imperfect. In theory, they worked very well, but these kind of stories have been a bit sporadic. But it wasn't just roulette during this period that gamblers started targeting. They also started targeting other games. And actually, one of the most successful gamblers in the world is a man by the name of Bill Benter. And when he was a student in the 70s, he came across this sign in an Atlantic City casino. Now, to him, this sign meant one thing. Card counting clearly works. And the whole idea of card counting is if you have games like blackjack, you're trying to get to a certain total, playing the dealer, and in blackjack you're trying to get near to 21 but not go over. So you've got to draw cards and try and get near this total. And on the face of it, this is a random game. The draw is completely random what will come out. But of course, it's not for a deck of cards, because if certain cards have already come out, they can't reappear until you shuffle the deck. So if you can collect information on what's already appeared, this can potentially give you an edge over the casino. It can give you an advantage against them. Now again, casinos started realizing what players were doing, that they were tracking what was in the deck. So they started using more decks of cards. Rather than one, they would use a whole pile. And this made it much harder to card count, because if there's multiple of the same card in the deck, it's much more difficult to keep track of what's come out and what hasn't. But the casinos were inadvertently handing the gamblers a very significant advantage. Because at the time, casinos typically used what's known as a dovetail shuffle. So this is probably familiar to you. You split the deck in two, you riffle the cards together. Now a dovetail shuffle, if you do it once, preserves an enormous amount of information about the cards. So just to give you an example, let's say we have a sequence of cards in order from ace to king. If we do a dovetail shuffle, we split them, I colour them just to make life a bit easier, and then we riffle them together. Now, they might not fall exactly interwoven, but you can see here in two different colours, you've got two quite clear, what's known as rising sequences of numbers. So cards have been shuffled, but actually, if you know where they started, at each point as you go from left to right, you know there's only one of two cards that could be appearing. And actually, there's a number of magic tricks that rely on this fact. So if you get a deck of cards and move one and then riffle shuffle, you can spot the moved card because it won't fit into one of these rising sequences. And actually, mathematicians have shown that for this kind of shuffle, you need to shuffle a deck at least half a dozen or so times to get something that's as good as random. And in casinos, in that period, people were actually only shuffling them once. So really, if you can track what's happened, you've got a huge amount of information about what's going on. And in many cases, they would actually sneak computers in, again, another application of computers in casinos, to track the cards that have come previously. And whereas before, card counters would measure what's come and then get kind of some approximation of what's left, now they would actually at each point in time know that it's only one of two cards that could appear. So this is a terrific advantage that they had. But this poses a challenge, because how do you capitalize on that? At each point in time, let's say there's a card that's advantageous and less beneficial. How do you make that decision about how much to risk in that situation? And what I want to do is just talk through a simple example. Let's suppose we have a coin toss, and I'm going to offer you a biased bet here. So I'm going to offer you 2-to-1 odds on tails. So in other words, you name an amount of money. If it comes up heads, you pay me that amount of money. If it comes up tails, then I will pay you double the amount you named. So clearly, that's a pretty stupid bet on my part. I'm giving you an advantage, but how much would you be willing to risk? After all, it is a coin toss, and you would still have a chance of losing money. Could I just get a quick show of hands? Who here would be willing to risk £1 on that bet? Show of hands? Okay, so I think most of you, keep your hand up if you'd be willing to risk £10. Okay, how about £100? Okay, and 500? Once. Okay, so there's a few people left. I'm not sure if they're playing with Monopoly money, but okay, so if you put your hands down, that wasn't legally binding, don't worry, but I want to give you a chance to kind of get that feeling of measuring risk. How much are you willing to risk in that situation? And I don't know if you can see, but actually the hands kind of went down a lot between 10 and £100. But this is quite an important question for gamblers. And actually in the 50s, a physicist called John Kelly started thinking about this idea of biased bets. Suppose you have inside information and you have some edge over a bookmaker or a casino. How do you exploit that? In this situation for you, although I gave all of you the exact same bets, mathematically it's the same offer, your perception of the value of that was very different. Some of you valued it at £1, some at 10, some at 500. What's the optimal thing to do there? And it's actually this concept known as utility. In economics, it's the value of something changes depending on how much money is in your wallet, for example, and how much you're willing to lose. And what Kelly did is he looked at these kind of two contrasting aims you have if you want to give a good long-term return. So what you're firstly trying to do is make money because you've got a biased bet, but you're also trying to avoid going bankrupt. Essentially, you're still tossing a coin. There's a chance you're going to lose. You know, I don't think anyone here would have bet their house on this. Maybe you would have. You might have an angry family. But in this case, you want to somehow exploit it, but also limit your losses. And what Kelly did was come up with this formula. So I apologize for my handwriting. Basically, you've got the odds, which in this case is 2. You've got the probability you'll win, this P win, minus the probability you'll lose. And this is the optimal fraction of your money to bet for a given edge over somebody in a wager situation. So the bet I just showed you, the odds were 2. The probability you win is a half, because it's a coin toss. Probability you lose is also a half. So if we stick these numbers in, you get the following kind of equation, a little bit of arithmetic. You can kind of end up with a quarter. So in this situation, if you want to maximize your long-term growth of money, it's optimal to risk about a quarter of your income. Just have a think back to kind of when you were raising hands, whether that was a quarter of, were you taking advantage or not? Now, some of you might think, okay, that's all well and good, you showed me a formula, let's test it out. Now, I could, of course, adopt the Carl Pearson approach and spend the next kind of half an hour or so tossing coins to convince you. That's a bit boring. So what I thought I'd do instead is show you some simulations of if we adopted different strategies, what kind of outcomes would we get. So here, along the vertical is your bankroll. I'm going to assume that you start with £100, and along the bottom is the coin flips. So we're going to play this bet again and again and again and see what you'd end up with over time. Now, you might have thought, a quarter of my money, that's not taking risks, I want to go big. You might say, well, I want to bet 80% of my money. And in this case, if we just do one random simulation, what might happen is you'll get a couple of big wins at the start. You're sort of approaching £1,000, lose a load of money, win a load of money, it's exciting, and then lose all your money and go bankrupt. Less exciting. If you adopt this optimal Kelly strategy and bet 25%, what will happen is it will take longer, you'll grow a bit slower over time, but you won't go bankrupt, and actually in the long term, you will get something that takes off. You might say, actually, that's still a bit too much for me, I'm going to bet 10% of my income on each one of these wagers. And in this case, if you do it randomly, it'll take a long time to grow. So you won't go bankrupt, but it'll take much more time to bet your money. And you notice this kind of increases quite steeply at the end, and that's because you're reinvesting your money. It's this kind of compound interest effect over time. Again, this is just one simulation. It's a coin toss, there's a bit of randomness. So what we could do is simulate it, say, 10 times. Instead of the sort of one instance here, do each one of these 10 times over. And in the case where you bet 80%, you're going to end up with something which 9 of these you go bankrupt. One of them, you do make a bit of money. But in most of these cases, you'll run out of your income pretty quickly. If you bet 25%, this optimal amount, then again, it grows a bit slower, but you don't go bankrupt at any point, and you will eventually grow your income. And then again, this 10% is just a much slower growth. So it just takes much, much more time to build this up over the series of bets. And this is the strategy that people use playing blackjack, playing a lot of these games to manage their bankroll. And actually the concept of utility and money management is obviously important in finance, but it underpins the entire insurance industry, because whether we insure something or not depends on how we value it. You know, whether we're willing to risk the fact we could lose it and cost ourselves a lot of money, or whether we take those small premiums. That will depend on the value of the item. But implementing this strategy, of course, for card counters can still be a problem. As one card counter I talked to said, learning to card count is easy. Learning to get away with it is very difficult. And many of these people who were successful, people like Bill Benter, soon became pretty well known in the world of casinos and found themselves banned from all the way around the world. So they turned their attention to a bigger game, a much sort of larger place to wager. Now this is Happy Valley Racecourse in Hong Kong. If you've ever been, Wednesday night, this is kind of where all the action is. On a typical race day, about $150 million are wagered. Gambling is an enormous part of what's going on here. And one of the appeals for this for gamblers is it's a fairly small, well, firstly, they're pretty convinced that, it's an honest operation, and it's a small pool of horses, about 1,000 horses that run again and again and again. So you can generate lots of data to look at and try and interpret which horse might have a good chance. But to do that, of course, you need some way of converting data into a measure of performance. Which horse is the best? Which horse is going to win? And to use this, teams turned to an idea that was first conjured up by this man. This is Francis Galton, a Victorian scientist, and cousin actually of Charles Darwin. And as you can see, they shared some passions, particularly for cravats and sideburns. But there were some differences. Darwin actually was meticulous in shaping his research. So even theory of evolution, you can see many of his fingerprints over this. Now, Galton kind of like think of himself more as an explorer. He would sort of dabble in anthropology and psychology and biology and economics, and then sort of start it off a bit and then leave it and wander off to something else. And one of the things he was interested in was inheritance. And he actually, on some occasions, would send his friends seeds and get them to grow them for him. It's kind of an early crowdsourcing approach. And get them to report back. And one of the things you've noticed is that if you grew seeds and then had the subsequent generation, if those were, for instance, taller, you wouldn't expect the next generation to be taller and taller and taller. That over time, you get a feature which he referred to as regression to mediocrity. That over time, these kind of features would somehow converge, and the influence of the older lineages might kind of smooth over variation. He wanted to kind of understand this in a slightly more rigorous way, and it was actually a horse trainer who presented him with a figure which allowed him to frame this kind of idea, and it was the following. It was a diagram. It was a square which represented the characteristics of a horse. And this trainer had proposed that about half of the characteristics were explained by the mother and the father, so we have a couple of squares for those, and then of the remaining characteristics, maybe a quarter is explained by the 4 grandparents, and then another chunk is explained by the great-grandparents, and so on. And this idea was one of the founders of what's known as regression theory in statistics, this idea that we can take a number of factors and work out how it influences the characteristics of a certain object or system. And we could have a similar approach in horse racing. We could say, well, let's suppose this box is the performance of the horse, and we have lots of different bits of past data, and we could say, well, maybe each one of these bits of data explains some amount of the horse's performance. Of course, this is a bit simplistic, really, isn't it? Because just like with the characteristics of inheritance, where, for instance, some of the variation explained by the parents are also going to be shared with the grandparents, the characteristics of the horse, these features are going to overlap. Some of these will explain multiple aspects. So these kind of things are going to be a bit more jumbled up. And what's more, we might not be able to explain all of the horse's performance. There might be some chunk which we still can't explain. I mean, the aim from a statistical point of view is to try and minimize this unknown quantity. And it was actually in the 80s, Bill Benter, visiting a library in Nevada, came across a paper by 2 researchers called Ruth Bolton and Randall Chapman. They work in marketing. They still do, actually. And they had essentially outlined this method for horse races, this approach of converting data into some kind of measure of performance that you could use to make predictions. And it was, as Bill said, it was the idea that sowed a multi-billion-pound industry, an incredibly important piece of research. And actually, for Ruth Bolton, it was the only paper she wrote about horse racing during her PhD. And it was really kind of a side project, but this had a huge impact on this industry. And I'm doing the analysis, there's early syndicates in Hong Kong. Certain things would come out as more important. For example, in one of their early bits of research, the number of races a horse had run would tell you a lot about how it was going to do. And it's tempting to come up with a story for that. We say, well, if it's run more races, then it's going to be more experienced, and then that's going to give it a better performance in the next race. But they actually avoid doing that because really they know it's a jumble, that all of these things are kind of going to overlap and explain one thing, and it's not clear that just because something's important, it has a direct explanation. This is quite a common problem in statistics. It's known as this idea that correlation doesn't always mean causation. To give an example, here we have, along the bottom is the wine spend per year of the Cambridge colleges. On the vertical is the exam results. So as you As you can see, there's a pretty strong correlation between colleges that spend more on wine have better results. And this isn't the only thing that happens. Actually, it turns out that countries that have a higher per capita spend on chocolate typically win more Nobel Prizes. As lovely as it would be that eating chocolate would make you a Nobel Prize winner and drinking wine would make you better at exams, there's clearly something else going on. There's some underlying feature which explains all of these things. And really, these syndicates, therefore, don't try and untangle it. And actually, one of the remarkable things is they have no desire to be pundits and experts on this kind of field. For them, the question is, what horse is going to win, not why is that horse going to win. So it's almost this, going back to the idea of ignorance, they're embracing their ignorance and they're saying, yeah, I don't really mind that I can't explain exactly how it's going, I just want a method that is going to give me good predictions. Now, starting off by measuring performance is one good thing, but actually, when you have multiple horses racing, you can get some slightly unexpected results occurring. So just an example, a very simple one, let's suppose we have two horses. We have one which half the time does well, half the time does badly. On the day, you don't know which it's going to be. And you have the second horse, which is a bastion of reliability. Every single race, exactly the same performance. Now, on average, over lots and lots of races, they've got the same kind of performance, because the top one, on average, that will cancel out. And in a race, it'll be essentially a 50-50, because it completely depends in a race whether the top horse, number one, is having a good day or a bad day. So if these two horses race against each other, it's basically a coin toss. It's a 50-50 chance, because if the top horse is having a good day, he's going to win. If he's having a bad day, he's going to lose. That's kind of intuitive. But if you add a third horse into the mix, something a bit strange happens. So let's suppose we have a third horse here, which some days performs slightly better than the middle horse, some days performs slightly worse. So again, on average, all these horses have the same performance. Now, by the same kind of logic, the top horse here, again, has a 50% chance of winning, because half the time he'll come out front, half the time he'll come out last. So he still has a 50% chance of winning. Of the two horses that remain, if the top horse doesn't win, we can kind of apply the same logic. That of these two horses on the bottom, if the horse number 3 has a good day, he's going to come out on top, and if he has a bad day, he's going to lose. So if the top horse doesn't win, you split the probabilities between the two horses remaining, because you can't decide. Now, just sort of take a look at what's going on here. All these horses, on average, have identical performance, but it's the variability that's different. And actually, the top horse, because it's most variable in this kind of race, has a larger chance of winning. You can actually apply the same kind of logic to other situations. So say we have an election with a first-past-the-post system, so the person who gets most votes wins. If you have 3 people who, on average, you would expect to get the same amount of votes, it's actually the most polarizing candidate, the kind of all-or-nothing one, which has the best strategy, because they've got the largest chance of winning in this situation. If you want to push the example a bit further, you could sort of look at job interviews, or maybe even dating, if you've got lots of different suitors. In this situation, it makes most sense to adopt this all-or-nothing kind of Marmite strategy, if the objective is to come out first against multiple people. This isn't a problem if there's only 2 in the race, but as soon as you have multiple competitors, you get this kind of weird dynamic coming out. And really, the mathematics of games and these kind of features have been of interest to mathematicians for a long time. Actually, the origins of game theory, the origins of mathematics of games originated with poker. In the 1920s, a researcher called John von Neumann, brilliant mathematician, he was the youngest professor in the history of the University of Berlin. Wasn't so good at poker, though. On the face of it, poker is a perfect game for a mathematician, right? It's the probability you get a certain hand, the probability your opponent gets a different one. But von Neumann realized there's more to it than that. He said, real life consists of bluffing, of little tactics of deception, of asking myself, what does the other man suppose I'm going to do? And he wanted to study that kind of feedback between what you think, what they think, and they think you think. And he looked at very simplified forms of poker. And one situation he looked at was 2 players. They each get dealt a single card, and then they put some money in the pot at the start. And the first player has a choice. So they can either just stick with their bet, in which case they just turn over their cards and compare them, or they can raise the stakes, and then it's up to the second player to decide whether they meet that bet or not. So 2 players, 1 card, money in the middle. What von Neumann found is that in these kind of games, you've got almost a tug of war, because each player is trying to maximize their gain while simultaneously trying to minimize their opponent's gain. If you think a game like poker, anything your opponent wins comes out of your pocket. So you're trying to maximize what you get while at the same time trying to minimize what they get. Which means that there's this kind of equilibrium point. There's a point at which the two sort of conflicting forces balance. And in this situation, analyzing for the game, he found that this situation in which no player would benefit by changing their strategy, this balance point for the first player, the strategy was as follows, that if they got a very high card, then they should raise the stakes. Intuitively, this makes sense. If you have a good card, you might as well bet on it. If they had a middling card, it didn't make sense for them to raise the stakes. They didn't have a great chance of winning, but they still had some chance. So in other words, they should just stick with their existing bet. But when von Neumann looked at what happened when you got the lowest kind of cards, he found that it doesn't make sense to stick with your bet, because if you turn over the cards, you're probably going to lose. Instead, you should up the stakes. So in other words, you should bluff. And actually, up to this point, gamblers had often, poker players were often bluffed in games, but it was always seen as a quirk of human psychology, a kind of innate trickery that humans came up with. But here was von Neumann showing that it was a mathematical necessity. In other words, he proved that bluffing is a necessary part of life. And this idea was kind of fundamental to game theory, that you can have these strategies put together. In this very simple version of poker, though, there's almost a list of fixed rules we can follow. So in other words, if you get high or low card, you raise the stakes. If you get a middling card, you stick with what you've got. And in any game where you've got all the information in front of you, so other games, for instance, things like noughts and crosses, checkers, chess, all of these games, in theory, have a fixed set of rules. It's known as pure strategy. So you follow these exact rules and you'll get the optimal result. So if something like noughts and crosses, I think most people can kind of work it out when they're younger, that they realize there's a set of moves, and if they always do that, they always get the result that's the best possible. But of course, not all games are like this. A good example is rock, paper, scissors. So it might be admirably consistent of you to always pick the same one, but if your opponent spots what you're doing, they can take advantage of that. So it's not the kind of optimal strategy if you're trying to make your opponent's decisions as difficult as possible. In these kind of games, that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to make your opponent indifferent to changing, because you've got that tug of war going on. So if they can gain more by adopting a different strategy, you haven't got the optimal approach. And in rock, paper, scissors, if you want to make your opponent's choices as difficult as possible, what you can just simply do is pick randomly. If you pick completely random options amongst those, then in the long run, your opponent won't be able to make any money off you. So this is kind of the optimal thing to do. And rock, paper, scissors, there's 3 options. It's not too hard to work out that picking randomly will make your opponent's decisions difficult. But games like poker are far more complex. You have a whole array of choices that you can make through the game. So it's not something you can actually write down with pen and paper. Unfortunately, we can turn to a technique that one of John von Neumann's colleagues devised, and this was a mathematician called Stanislav Ulam. And unlike many mathematicians, he wasn't a big fan of working through loads of equations. On one occasion, he was working on a blackboard trying to solve a quadratic, got to the end, and was just so frustrated and annoyed he went home for the day. So it really kind of wasn't his thing to kind of crunch through all this algebra. And he was once playing Canfield, which is a version of Solitaire, and he wondered what the probability would be if he just laid out the cards. What's the probability he'd have a situation where he could win that game, if the cards would fall in a favourable way? Started looking at calculations and realized it was just a lot of effort. So instead he thought, well, what if I just lay out the cards a few times and see what happens? In other words, what if I just simulate this process a few times and get some sense of how likely it is? At the time, Ulam and von Neumann were working on the US nuclear program at Los Alamos, working on neutron collisions. Part of the project was the hydrogen bomb. And again, these were random processes where you couldn't neatly write down the formulas and solve them. And they realized this method would be incredibly powerful for that. Being a government program, they needed a code name for it, so they called it the Monte Carlo method, because Ulam had a heavy gambling uncle at the time. And the Monte Carlo method has become a fundamental part of science. I mean, in my line of work, where we try and look at disease outbreaks, you have something like Ebola or Zika, that's an incredibly complex set of interactions. It's not something you can write down with pen and paper neatly. And so we use these simulation-based approaches, simulating these random processes to understand these systems. It also appears in areas of sports betting, when you're trying to understand how these very kind of complex team interactions work. And it also applies to poker. Teams have used this kind of approach for games of poker where you can't neatly solve the equations. You can use a simulation-based approach to get the computers to learn. And actually, Alan Turing, one of the fathers of computing, when he was first thinking about this idea of machine learning, said that actually, if you're trying to build an intelligent machine, it doesn't make sense to build the adult mind. You don't want to try and build the finished product with all the knowledge and rules there. It makes much more sense to build the child's mind and let it learn, let it work out how to play these kinds of games. And this is what these poker teams do. They create these algorithms that can learn. And actually, the way in which they learn is perhaps a bit surprising, because what they do is they get these algorithms over time to employ what's known as regret minimization. So as they play these games billions of times against each other, at each point when they've made a decision, they look back and say, could I improve that if I'd done something differently? So at each point, they kind of have an artificial measure of regret for each decision they make. And actually, there's a lot of evidence from some neuroscience studies that that ability to have regret is quite important in learning games of chance. There's been studies of people who have damaged the bit of the brain that's responsible for regret, this ability to kind of look backward and ask, how would I feel if I'd done something differently? And those people often are perfectly capable of playing logic games. If they have to sort cards, absolutely fine at that. If there's any element of risk to the game and they have to learn how to play the optimal strategy, that's something they really struggle with. And actually, a lot of economic theories developed not around looking back, but around what's known as expectation maximization. So in other words, you look forward and you say, if I did this, could I make money? If I did this, could I make more? But really, from these kind of artificial intelligence approaches, it seems that it's much more powerful to look back and kind of employ that power of regret as you go to kind of look back on your decisions as you take these risks. And in fact, these teams have employed these algorithms and got these computer bots to play each other so many times that last year they announced that poker is solved. Well, to be specific, for two-player poker, where the stakes have a limit, these bots have played each other so many times that they've come up with a strategy which will not be expected to lose money in the long run. So even if you're playing a perfect opponent, this bot would not lose money over the course of a sort of very long game. Interestingly, actually, a lot of the players who came up with this system, a lot of the computer scientists aren't very good at poker themselves. By their own admission, they're not poker players. So this is a kind of remarkable illustration of the power of these algorithms. You can have people who aren't particularly good at poker creating poker bots that can beat any human, arguably. But this is a remarkable achievement, but there is, of course, a downside of this, and that you're assuming that your opponent is perfect. If you're kind of looking for this optimal strategy, that's inherently defensive, because you're assuming that your opponent's perfect, and you're almost giving them too much credit. Because if you've got a flawed opponent, and you're coming up with a strategy that assumes they're perfect, you're kind of potentially not exploiting them as much as you could. And just to give an example of these kind of flaws that could occur, let's go back to rock, paper, scissors. What I'd like you all to do is just turn to the person next to you and play a couple of games of rock, paper, scissors with them, please. Okay, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, I can see there's a couple of people at the back trying to play a best of 7 or something, but okay, what I'd like to do, just have a quick show of hands of who opened with rock there. Okay, a fair few. Who opened with scissors? Quite, and who opened with paper? Okay, not so many actually for paper. So typically in these kind of big competitions where people play lots of times, it's the novices that open with rock, often men. Sorry. Scissors tends to be the kind of most popular people who play a lot of these games. And the paper's not always chosen so commonly. And also think about what happened between the first game and the second game you played. Because in one sort of fairly large study of rock, paper, scissors, what happened was people who win the first round typically stick with the same move for the second go. So it's this kind of old, the military adage, isn't it, of generals always fight the last war, especially if they won it. So this idea that if you won, you just stick with what's safe. People who lost, however, will often switch to the move that would have beaten the one they lost to. So if they lost to rock, they'll often swap to paper on the next go. So it doesn't always happen, but in these kind of large competitions, these kind of patterns emerge. So although the optimal thing to do in rock, paper, scissors is to behave completely randomly, people don't. They fall into these predictable patterns. And there was actually a story a few years ago in Japan. An electronics firm wanted to auction off their art collection. And they approached Christie's and Sotheby's to hold the auction. They were obviously both keen to do it. And so the head of the electronics firm decided the fairest way to settle it would be with a game of rock, paper, scissors. Now, Sotheby's thought, that's perfectly random. That's nice. That's fine. Christie's, however, the CEO in Japan had a young daughter, a 7-year-old, who played relentlessly in the playground. So he got his daughter to teach him a bit of rock, paper, scissors strategy. And they walked in, sure enough, to the boardroom. Sotheby's treating it like a random game. Christie's with a strategy. Christie's walked out the winner. So in this kind of case, exploiting those patterns and those kind of predictability and knowledge of what's happened before can be extremely valuable. But there are some challenges to that, and particularly if you're playing kind of computers, one of the challenges from a human point of view is the limitation of our memory. So just to kind of illustrate this point, what I'd like to do now is to just all of you try and memorize that number for me. So I'll give you a couple of moments to kind of have a quick look at it. Okay. Right, who fancies having a go at trying to recite it? Any volunteers? Yes, sir? 10260100060. Very, very close. Does anyone want to have another go? What was your name, sorry? Gavin. So Gavin got very close. Anyone want to try and build on that? Yes?
610, 260, 1091.
So what's your name? Steve. Steve, round of applause for Steve, ladies and gentlemen. Now, Steve did something quite clever there. I don't know if you spotted it. I'll explain what he did. So I asked you to memorize 10 digits. And that was actually a bit devious of me because in a lot of psychological studies, people presented with numbers can typically memorize about 7 and recite them. Sorry? 12 digits? In what? Oh, sorry. Yeah, okay. I do have a PhD in maths, I assure you. Okay, so actually I made it even harder. I was crueler than I thought. I do apologize. And so typically people can remember, like a local telephone number, they can remember 2 they struggle with. But what actually Steve did, when he recited the numbers, he didn't recite those kind of individually. He said like 610, 260, 1091. So actually what he did, he bunched the numbers together. He wasn't reciting 10 bits of information, he was chunking it into a smaller amount, which kind of put it below that threshold that you can memorize. And actually other countries, so France, for instance, if you go, their telephone numbers tend to be paired together, which actually makes it easier to remember the numbers because it's much easier for you to remember these kind of chunks of numbers rather than just a single sequence. But I can actually guarantee that all of you will remember this number when you go home tonight. And that's actually, if you split it apart and add in some punctuation and then flip it around, that's just the time and date of this talk. So all of you now will know that number and be able to recite it. And the reason is you've gone from 10 bits of seemingly arbitrary information down to 1 that clearly has some meaning to you. And this ability to chunk is something that card counters employ. Because clearly memorizing a whole deck of cards is incredibly difficult. So what they do is they use what's known as bucketing. They will group into, say, low cards, medium cards, high cards. And then rather than having to memorize a whole deck, they'll only have these 3 buckets to remember. And what's more, it's kind of a memoryless property. So they don't have to remember everything. They can just keep the tallies of these 3 values. Of course, there are some people out there that can memorize vast numbers of cards. The top memory champions can memorize about 1,000 cards in an hour. 1,000 playing cards an hour, that's remarkable. And the way they do that is they actually attach characters to the cards. This will make them people and objects, and they attach a story to that. And similarly, like, while you will all remember this, because you're not remembering a number, you're remembering an event, you remember a single thing, which is much more memorable. And that's really kind of how humans can get around this idea of the limitation of memory. But there are some disadvantages to learning about your opponent and remembering things and trying to take advantage of them. And that's, if your opponent is incredibly smart, they could teach you the wrong image of themselves. So it's what's known as the get taught and exploited problem. If you're playing poker, for instance, your opponent could pretend to be very passive and pretend to be very timid, and then once you kind of learned that notion of how they play, they could actually switch their behavior and exploit the fact that you've learned the incorrect perception of them. It's not just poker this happens. A couple of months ago, you may have seen it, Microsoft launched a bot for Twitter to learn from, you can see where this is going, to try and learn language. And the idea was have conversations and improve its ability to learn. Twitter users unfortunately decided to teach it some unfortunate tricks. What actually happened in 24 hours, it had to be taken down because it was coming out with so many horrendous opinions. I think that's an example of, you can have quite an intelligent algorithm, but if it's being fed the wrong image of what it should be doing, it can actually veer off track very quickly. And at this point, I've talked about poker bots, which play billions of games to refine their strategy. I've talked about these language bots. But in many situations, these bots aren't very complicated. In finance, for example, programs are designed to be fast. If you're trading, if you want to get a trade off, you need to do that quickly. So having that huge amount of complexity and nuance and rationality in your algorithm isn't going to do the job. You really want to strip it down as simple as possible. In many cases, these high-speed algorithms, you might just have a few lines of code. And there's one economics researcher I talked to put it, when you have 10 lines of code, you're not even at insect-level intelligence. You've got no rationality and no nuance in there. You're just trying to execute the trades as quickly as possible. In some situations, this means that you can run into trouble. There's a case recently in Norway where two traders had noticed that a US stockbroker had an algorithm that was feeding trades into the market, and the algorithm would always react to a trade in the same way. So in other words, if you traded with it, it would change its price by the same amount, no matter how big that trade was. So what these people in Norway did was teach the algorithm what to do. So it made lots of little trades, so it would move its price up. Then it would make a big trade and profit from the difference. Now, this ended up in court. These two traders were charged with market manipulation and handed suspended sentences. But then there's kind of a Robin Hood reputation in the media for them in Norway, and it went to appeal. And their appeal lawyer made the point of, if they had been trading against a stupid human who was doing this, that wouldn't be a problem. The issue is that they were trading against a stupid algorithm, presumably created by a human that hadn't been thinking what they were doing. And how should this be different? How should the notion of skill and responsibility be different because there's a kind of one step away from the argument? And actually this argument held in court, and in this situation, they were actually, this sort of sentence was revoked. And it isn't the first instance these very simple algorithms run into trouble. At a similar point, actually, a US stockbroker was introducing a new algorithm to feed orders into the market. So you have a lot of orders from clients coming to the stockbroker, and it would want to feed them in. They had 8 servers doing this. What they had is a counter, actually, to keep track. Because obviously, if you've got lots of orders coming in and you're sort of sending them out to the market, you want to keep track of how many you've completed. You don't want to kind of accidentally make too many. And they had one of these counters at each server, and then they updated their software, but by all accounts, they didn't add the counter to the 8th server. So there are 7 servers that knew what they were doing, the 8th one that was kind of doing its own thing. And when this went live, what happened was the 7 were behaving as they should. The 8th just peppered the market with high-speed trades. And actually, by the time they worked out what was happening and shut it down, in 45 minutes, it had lost about $450 million. So that's $170,000 a second for this runaway algorithm, because it was acting so fast and so much beyond what kind of humans could control. And you might call that bad luck, you might call that a sort of error in skill. And I think those cases around these kind of games and chance events are developing. Actually, in the US in recent years, there's been a big crackdown on poker, particularly online, and as well in 2012 there was a crackdown on New York on poker rooms, and a gentleman who was running a poker room was taken to court and charged with operating a gambling operation. Now, many casino games in federal law are defined as gambling. But poker isn't one of them. So actually, whether it was gambling or not was kind of up for debate. And in federal law, gambling is defined as anything that is predominantly due to chance. So any game that's predominantly the result of chance is defined as gambling. So what happened is this entire legal case rested on, is poker a game of chance or a game of skill? And they got economists coming in, mathematicians, and they made the point that on a single game of poker, of course there's an element of luck, because you've got this deal, but then equally, in baseball, someone pitching a single ball, there's going to be an element of chance involved. But over the course of a poker game, typically the more skillful players won. And this is the first time, actually, that a US court had ruled on whether poker was a game of chance or a game of skill, and they ruled that it was a game of skill. There's a footnote to the story. The following year, when it went to the state appeals court. Now, in New York state law, gambling is defined as anything that has a material element of chance. So if you think about it, this is a much narrower definition of gambling. It's not predominantly chance, it's anything with a material element, which clearly poker does have, and under this condition, it's defined as gambling. And this debate is ongoing. If you look at fantasy sports in the US and a lot of these systems where do we have something that's luck? Do we have something that's skill? Where do we actually define these things as gambling? I think there's often a temptation, in fact, with these situations, to put things in boxes. We like to say there's a box with luck and there's a box with skill. I think typically, if we're good at something, it goes in the box on the right. If we're bad at something, it goes in the box on the left. And that's really kind of tempting, but I don't think it's a realistic notion necessarily. I think particularly through the history of how people have tackled games like roulette and with lotteries, it's much more of a spectrum. And actually games that we might think are the archetype of luck, things like roulette, actually if you have a skillful approach, you can tame that chance and you can convert it into some element of a game of skill. And even games that we might think are incredibly or almost solely the result of skill, games like chess, can have surprising results of chance. In the 90s, famously, IBM's Deep Blue chess computer played Garry Kasparov. And during the match, in one of the early games, there was a situation where Deep Blue made a move that was so unexpected and almost kind of so subtle that it threw Kasparov a bit. And it, by all accounts, convinced him that he was playing something that was just simply beyond what he was ever seen before, just something completely beyond his capability. It turned out, actually, that what happened there is Deep Blue had run into a situation where it couldn't identify the best move. And in that situation, it had been programmed to pick randomly. So this set of games that is one of the landmarks in artificial intelligence over humans in a game that is thought to be purely skill was actually really kind of shaped by this chance event. And I think these kind of illustrations show why gambling and why these kind of games of chance are so important, because really whatever your views are of casinos and bookmakers, gambling is an inherent part of life. Betting is an inherent part of what we do, whether it's in health, in kind of prediction on this side, whether it's in business, whether in finance. We have to make decisions with hidden information. We have to deal with uncertainty. We have to balance the risks against the rewards. I think that's why, historically, so many researchers have been interested in gambling and continue to do so. Because really, if you want to understand luck and decision-making and risk, then arguably there's no way better to start than with a bet. So thank you.
What your view or where investing in the stock market might fall between luck and skill. Should I pay somebody a 2% fee for their skill in investing my money, or should I just rely on buying the market?